Hello, welcome to Spotlight America, the show that gives young American adults a real voice. I'm Actor Khan. Now, the scenes in the last few months, actually since President Obama was re-elected, is like watching the US Open, back and forth, back and forth. You see politicians going back and forth between Capitol Hill and the White House. There's been, in fact, so much toing and froing. Well, finally, it's come to this, a government shutdown. The Republican Party fundamentally at odds with President Obama, so what's new? That's the short and quick version. But the pantomime, and to me, it's been a total and utter farce, still rages on. At the center of the government shutdown, in my opinion, is the trouble within the GOP party. For me, it's not so much about letting the people down, because that's too obvious, but it's about egos, vanity, securing one's political legacy, trying to outdo one another, and so on. After the election, the GOP went through some soul searching, trying to find its identity, purpose, meaning, and trying to champion the cause of an ever-evolving society of different colors, ages, and races. The infighting has gotten so bad that the government shutdown is now being used as a tool to try and beat the Democrats and the president on the one hand, and on the other, to launch their own political campaign as a potential presidential nominee for the Republican Party. Now, it sickens me to think that someone could stoop so low. Anyway, to discuss these and other matters affecting the country is David Lasker, Director of Communications for the Republican Party, and joins us now from New York. David, thank you so much indeed for joining us here on the program. From here?
Right now, I think there's going to be a pretty heavy focus on Obamacare. The implementation of this law has been disastrous. It's been even worse than Republicans said it was going to be. The websites couldn't even handle traffic, and not a lot of people were signing up. I mean, this has been a disaster. Even the likes of Ezra Klein on the left are writing about it. Max Baucus, one of the bill's chief authors, called it a train wreck. Republicans aren't going to stop trying to scale back the implementation of this bill, or at least make it as smooth as possible so it doesn't interfere with the American people's ability to get health care that they already have. That's going to be a big issue going forward. In addition, we're going to look at the way this country's spending money. Look, the debt ceiling is going to come up again. The continuing resolution is going to come up again later this winter. So we're not going to stop talking about these issues. This country's spending too much money. We're going to be approaching $17 trillion of debt the next time the debt ceiling is raised. These are issues that have to be addressed, whether it's now or in 2014. These are serious issues that the Republican Party will be looking at.
The constant wrangling between the opposition and, of course, President Obama, it doesn't bode very well for America PLC. What do you think it's doing for the image of the country?
Oh, it's not great. People around the world see a country that's barely able to function, that's barely able to govern itself. Partisanship in Washington is totally out of control. No doubt about it. But at the end of the day, the president really has to lead. People say, oh, well, John Boehner is obstructing Obama at every turn. Look, if you're a student of American history, you know that John Boehner is no more opposed to Barack Obama's agenda than Newt Gingrich was to Bill Clinton's, or certainly Tip O'Neill was to Ronald Reagan's. And yet a strong president is able to lead Congress and lead the country where he wants to take them. Harry Truman famously had a sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." President Obama should have a sign on his desk that says, "Out to lunch." This guy is not involved in negotiations the way he needs to be. He'd rather go and work the cameras and get in his bully pulpit and take the case right to the American people to hurt his political enemies than actually negotiate to do the business of the American people. And that's a big part of what's wrong here. Presidential leadership is missing in Washington.
Yeah, but hold on, isn't that somewhat disingenuous there? Because, President Obama has been out there negotiating with...
But actor, they also re-elected a Republican Congress, and they didn't send them there not to negotiate. People actually, believe it or not, tend to like divided government because it forces moderation, forces negotiation. You've got an unprecedented situation in Washington where the president won't even sit down and meet with congressional leaders until the government is already shut down. So, absolutely, look, Barack Obama didn't run on a platform of, "I will never negotiate with Republicans." That's not what he was elected to do. He was elected to lead this country in whatever direction he ran on. I mean, granted, I would argue really that he ran on bringing Mitt Romney down more than he did on his own accomplishments, because he really didn't have very many to run on. Well, but this president was not sent to Washington to sit in the Oval Office and for Joe Biden to go sit in Camp David during the debt ceiling negotiations. He hasn't been doing what he needs to.
Once again, isn't that unfair to say that President Obama has been out there pushing his own agenda, because he has been having lunches and meetings, he's been heading up to Congress to meet members of the opposition. So he has been
the week or two
involved
before the
in
government shut down, that he totally removed himself. He's from the process. He said, I'm not going to negotiate. I'm not going to give anything. Who knows what he said privately in those meetings? But publicly, he said, I'm not giving anything on the debt ceiling. I'm not giving anything on the continuing resolution. That's not helpful. You have to give when you have divided government. There has to be negotiations. And you've seen Republicans go from one position to another, to another, to another, to another. And you've seen Democrats stay way out here and say absolutely no movement on the debt ceiling or the continuing resolution. And they gave not an inch, but maybe half an inch to reopen the government and raise the debt limit. So I really think that the stonewalling here is coming from the White House directly. And it's not fair to blame Republicans for wanting to use the debt ceiling and the continuing resolution as points of negotiation.
So I've seen the short version of the Obamacare bill, and it's very much like the National Health Service as we have in the UK. In the short term, it's going to hurt Americans, but in the long term, it's going to benefit an awful lot of Americans. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, first of all, we totally disagree with your assessment that Obamacare is good for America in the long run. And I won't get into the weeds with you on the NHS because I'm no expert in British health policy, but I do know that there are a number of measures that American healthcare actually has over British healthcare. For example, our cancer survivor rates in Britain and in Canada. Very often, the waiting period to get a colonoscopy is longer than the amount of time it takes colon cancer, for example, to metastasize into other parts of the body. So if you look at something like colon cancer, our survival rate is far better here in America, where supposedly we have such terrible health care. Now, look, the real issue with health care in America is cost. It's too expensive, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But the real tragedy of Obamacare is that this president blew the opportunity to address the cost of healthcare in America. Instead, he addressed coverage and insurance and putting as many additional people into a bad system as possible. That was a real failure. They really dropped the ball with that. We should have addressed the employer-based model, which really isn't great to begin with, and a number of other issues. So I think that the focus was in the totally the wrong place when we talked about healthcare in America, and I do think it's going to get worse. And part of the reason is that if people react rationally to incentives, this bill doesn't work. This bill assumes that healthy young people will get on the Obamacare exchanges and will be willing to pay higher premiums than they usually do in order to make the system work out of whatever notions of solidarity that are coming out of the administration. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen. There was a post that was going around the Daily Kos this afternoon. Daily Kos, as you know, is a big liberal blog, and one of their writers said, my premiums just doubled. Him and his wife, he lives in California, their health premiums literally doubled overnight. He said, look, I'm not paying this, and I'm sure as heck not going to pay the fine that the administration is leveling at me. I mean, he was indignant, and he deserved it. And he deserved to be, because in many cases, the exchange prices aren't in line with what people were getting in the private sector beforehand, and those weren't good prices to begin with. So I reject the assumption that Obamacare is going to ultimately be good for the American people. I think there's no evidence of that whatsoever, and I do think that the evidence points to Republican directions. The early returns are terrible. Why would we expect that out of these terrible early returns we would get positive results?
Wouldn't it be fair to say that actually you've lost the PR battle as far as the whole shutdown issue is concerned and Obamacare?
No, look, I totally disagree with that assessment. First of all, if you want to say we've lost the PR battle over the government shutdown, I'll cede you that for sure. But the president's taken a lot of hits too. Remember, we have not lost the PR battle over Obamacare. Americans never supported this bill. They didn't want it. They didn't support it. They turned Congress in 2010 because of this bill, and they still don't support it. So as far as big picture stuff is concerned, Americans are still against this bill. And now that they're going and reading that liberal pundits are starting to turn against it during the implementation phase, there is no doubt that Americans do not support Obamacare. Do they support Republican tactics on the shutdown? Perhaps not. But they don't support Obamacare. And when 2014 rolls around, this is going to be a distant memory. The implementation of Obamacare will be fresh. There'll be a whole other round of disasters, and we're going to revisit this big time.
Okay. All right, David. Listen, thank you so much indeed for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
David Lasker there from the GOP party in New York. And of course, you can see more from David over the coming months here on Spotlight America. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the show. Once again, if there's anything you'd like us to cover on the program, then you can email me or the team directly. Just visit www.spotlightamericatv.com. And of course, we'd love to hear from you. Remember, it can be anything that's current, past, or impending. Anyway, until next time, from me, Actor Khan, and the rest of the team here on the program, goodbye, and thanks for watching. Bye.